One day you will look in the mirror and for just a moment you will not recognize yourself, not because something is wrong and not because you have suddenly changed, but because something has always been changing and for the first time you noticed it. We like to think of aging as something happening to us, as if time were out there moving forward and we are simply trying to keep up. But what if that is not true? What if time is not something you move through? What if you are the movement itself? You are not standing on the riverbank watching life pass by. You are the river, and what you call getting older is simply the river changing its shape. It was always like this. The child you once were is gone, not hidden inside you and not waiting to return, but gone completely, and yet you still say that was you. This is the strange thing about being human. You are a continuity without ever being the same, a process that appears as a person. When you are young, this feels like growth, like expansion, like becoming more energy, more identity, more future. Everything seems to be building towards something, but then slowly, almost invisibly, the direction begins to change, not outward but inward. And this is where discomfort begins because the world you live in does not understand this direction. It tells you that life is about gaining, about building, about becoming more and more without end. So when things begin to slow down and soften, it feels like something is being taken away, like loss, like decline. But if you look more carefully, you may begin to see something else entirely. What in your life has ever truly stayed the same? Your thoughts come and go like clouds. Your emotions rise and fall like waves. Your relationships change, deepen, and fade. Even your body is constantly renewing itself while appearing to age. Everything you are is in motion, and yet you search for something that does not move, something solid, something you can call me and hold on to. This is where the fear begins, not in aging itself, but in the idea that there is something to lose. Now think about your body. When you are young, you barely notice it. It works, it responds, it carries you without question. But as you grow older, it begins to speak, not with words, but with sensation, tension, slowness, fatigue, and you interpret this as failure, as if the body were betraying you. But what if it is not failing? What if it is simply changing its language? What if it is no longer trying to take you outward, but inward, into awareness? Because when the body slows down, you begin to notice things you never saw before. The way you walk, the way you breathe, the texture of a single moment when you are actually present inside it. This is not loss. It is a shift from doing to being. But because you have been taught that doing is everything, being feels like nothing, and yet there is a kind of clarity that only appears when everything else begins to quiet down. When you are young, you are always becoming something, trying to arrive, trying to be someone, but arrive where and become who? At some point, you begin to notice that every destination you chased has already passed and every version of yourself you tried to become is already gone. And still you are here, still aware, still something. And that realization can feel unsettling because it quietly reveals that there is no final version of you, no finished self waiting at the end, only this continuous unfolding. And growing old is not moving toward an ending, but moving deeper into that truth. And as this realization begins to settle more deeply into your experience, something else starts to shift, not in your body and not in your memory, but in the way you relate to time itself, because most people live as if time was something they are losing, something slipping away, something that must be managed carefully before it runs out. And so aging becomes frightening because it feels like a countdown, as if life were a container slowly emptying toward nothing. But this idea depends on a very subtle illusion, the illusion that you are separate from time, that you are an object moving through it like a traveler moving across a landscape. Yet if you look closely, you may begin to notice something very different. That time is not something you move through at all, but something that describes the movement of your own experience, because the ticking of a clock is not time itself, it is only a measurement, and the calendar is not time, it is only a symbol. What you actually know of time is always this moment, and this moment, and this moment, endlessly appearing, never stacking up in the way you imagine, never accumulating into something you can hold. And so when you say you are getting older, what you really mean is that the content of your experience is changing, that sensations, thoughts, and feelings are shifting, but the awareness in which all of this happens remains strangely untouched. And this is why even people late in life often say that inside they still feel the same, because the simple sense of being, the quiet feeling of I am, does not age at all. It has no wrinkles, no weight, no years. It is as present now as it was in the very beginning. And yet this is overlooked because attention is always pulled toward what is changing rather than what is constant beneath the change. Now this brings us gently to something deeper, the fear that sits behind all others, the fear of death. Because if aging feels like a gradual dissolving of who you think you are, then death appears as the final disappearance, and naturally the mind resists this, because it imagines that something real is about to be taken away. But if you pause and look carefully, you may begin to see that everything you fear losing has already been changing from the very start. Nothing has remained the same. Even for a moment, the body you had years ago is gone, the thoughts you had yesterday are gone, the person you were in childhood is gone, and yet none of this felt like death. It felt like life continuing, unfolding, transforming. So what makes death seem so different is not the change itself, but the idea that there will be no one left to experience it, that awareness itself will vanish. But this assumption rests on the belief that awareness belongs to you, that it is something you possess, and this is where confusion begins, because awareness is not something you have, it is what you are, and you cannot step outside of it to observe its absence. You cannot experience not being aware, because any such experience would already be awareness, and so the fear becomes difficult to define. Like trying to imagine the end of space or the absence of existence itself, it slips away the moment you try to grasp it. This does not mean that the body will not die or that life will continue in the same form. Clearly it will not, but it suggests that what you fundamentally are is not limited to those forms in the way you imagine. It is more like the sky than the clouds, more like the ocean than the waves. Because clouds come and go and waves rise and fall, but the sky and the ocean are not diminished by these changes, they express themselves through them. And in the same way your life is not something you own. It is something that is happening, something that is expressing itself as you. And when this begins to be felt, not just understood intellectually but sensed directly, there is a softening, a quiet release of the need to hold on to everything so tightly. You no longer feel the same urgency to preserve every detail, to resist every change, to cling to every role. Instead, there is a growing willingness to let things pass, to allow moments to complete themselves without trying to freeze them in place. And this does not make life dull. It makes it more vivid, because when you are no longer grasping, you are more open to what is actually here, a simple conversation, a passing sound, the movement of air against your skin. All of these become richer when they are not being compared to what they used to be or what they should become. And so growing old begins to feel less like narrowing and more like deepening, less like losing and more like seeing, Like the difference between the bright intensity of midday and the subtle depth of evening. Neither is better, they simply reveal different aspects of the same sky. But because we have been taught to value intensity, we fear the softening, we resist the fading, as if something essential is disappearing, yet if you watch carefully, you will see that the fading is not disappearance at all. It is transformation, a movement into something quieter, more spacious, more refined. And in this movement, certain qualities begin to emerge: patience, stillness, a kind of gentleness, a capacity to observe without needing to interfere. And these are not things that can be forced or achieved. They arise naturally when the need to control begins to loosen, because much of our resistance to aging comes from a desire to remain in control, to shape life according to our expectations, to maintain a certain image of ourselves. But control is always partial, always temporary, and the more tightly you try to hold everything in place, the more tension you feel as it inevitably changes. But when you begin to see life as a process rather than a possession, as something you participate in rather than something you own, the need for control begins to soften. You can still act, still choose, still care deeply, but without the constant pressure that everything must remain exactly as you want it to be. And in this there is a kind of freedom, a quiet trust, not in specific outcomes, but in the unfolding itself, a recognition that whatever arises is part of the same movement that has always carried you from one moment to the next. And in this trust, even difficult experiences begin to change their character. Discomfort, uncertainty, limitation, they do not disappear, but they are no longer interpreted as signs that something has gone wrong. They are seen as part of the same flow, part of the same shifting pattern, and because you are no longer resisting them in the same way, they do not create as much inner conflict. There may still be pain, but there is less suffering, because suffering is often not the experience itself, but the resistance to it. And as this resistance softens, there is a growing sense of connection, not necessarily to specific identities or roles, but to life itself, because when the boundaries of your identity become less rigid, the separation between you and the world becomes less defined, you begin to notice that the same processes happening within you are happening everywhere, the same impermanence, the same movement, the same constant change, and in seeing this, your aging no longer feels like something isolated, something happening only to you. It becomes part of a much larger pattern, an expression of the same movement that shapes everything. And in this recognition, there is a quiet sense of belonging, not the belonging of fitting into something, but the belonging of being part of the whole process itself, not separate from it, not outside of it, but one of its expressions, appearing and disappearing in its own time. And this understanding does not need to be held as a belief. It can be felt directly in the simple observation of what is happening right now. The breath moving in and out, sensations arising and fading, thoughts appearing and dissolving, all of it changing, all of it moving, and yet all of it held within a single field of awareness. And as you rest in that awareness, even briefly, you may begin to sense that nothing essential is being lost, that what is changing the forms, the appearances, the patterns, but not the underlying reality in which they occur. And this does not make you indifferent. It allows you to care without clinging, to engage without needing to control, to participate fully while recognizing the transient nature of everything. And perhaps this is the quiet wisdom that emerges with age, not something you gain, but something that reveals itself as what is unnecessary begins to fall away, a simplicity, a directness, a way of being that is less concerned with becoming something and more open to simply being what is. And in that openness there is a kind of peace, not because everything is perfect, but because it no longer needs to be, and eventually, without effort, without decision, something very quiet begins to happen. Not something you achieve and not something you force, but something that unfolds on its own, like the way night arrives without being pushed, like the way a sound fades into silence without resistance. The need to understand begins to loosen, the need to arrive somewhere begins to soften, and the question that once felt so important, what am I becoming? What will happen to me? What is the meaning of all this? Begins to dissolve, not because it has been answered, but because it is no longer necessary. And in its place there is something much simpler, something that was always here but rarely noticed, a direct awareness of this moment exactly as it is, without the urge to turn it into something else, without the need to improve it or escape it. The sound of your breath, the feeling of your body resting where it is, the quiet movement of thoughts passing through like distant clouds, none of it demanding anything from you, none of it incomplete. It is just this. And strangely, that is enough. Not as an idea and not as a belief, but as something you can feel when you stop searching for something more. And as you rest here, even for a moment, the sense of time begins to change, not because time disappears, but because the pressure of time begins to fade. The feeling that something must be done before it is too late begins to dissolve. Because too late for what? Too late to become something you were never meant to fix. Too late to arrive at a destination that was never stable to begin with. And so the urgency softens, the constant reaching begins to slow, and what remains is not emptiness, but a kind of fullness that does not depend on movement or achievement. It is like sitting by the ocean and no longer needing the waves to be different, no longer waiting for something to happen, simply allowing what is already happening to be enough. And in that allowance there is a quiet ease, a natural stillness, not the absence of change, but the absence of resistance to change. Life continues to move, the body continues to shift, moments continue to appear and disappear, but something within this movement no longer struggles against it. And in that there is a kind of peace, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but steady and simple, like the sky that remains unchanged behind every passing cloud. And perhaps this is what growing old was always leading toward, not a loss of life, but a return to something more fundamental, a way of being that does not depend on becoming anything else, a quiet recognition that nothing essential has ever been missing, and nothing essential can ever be taken away. And when this is seen, even faintly, there is nothing left to hold on to and nothing left to let go of, because the movement of holding and letting go has itself come to rest, leaving only this simple presence, this awareness that has been here through every change, every stage, every version of you, never aging, never diminishing, simply here, waiting not to be found, but to be noticed.